Hi, everybody.
Welcome back to All That Work for Nothing, where we like to really put our name to the test.
I know we always have. It's fun doing this, but
It is.
It's also like the challenges. The challenges make it fun, but that's at the end when we overcome the challenge.
Once we've overcome the challenge and we've uploaded this to all of the platforms, that's when it feels good. Anyways, we're just gonna get right into it. We got a lot of subject today. We will be talking again about the man, the myth, and the legend of what not to do, Reagan. Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, for those who saw our last episode, we went and saw the Reagan movie, and it was an awkward time. Fun, very fun. But
was it? There was a period of time where we were getting so angry in the movie that we were like, should we leave?
We got close to leaving.
We did, because it was such a horrible depiction of how Reagan actually was as a person and as a leader. So this episode is going to go more into Reagan as a leader, specifically as a governor of California, a little bit about his presidency, and then we're also going to be going into Nancy, and we're going to be talking about myth making. Because it's very important that you should look at, with your leaders and the people that are supposed to be running this country, with a critical lens. So this is what we're doing this episode, is we are trying to combat the glaze session that was the movie Reagan with some facts.
Yeah, so we're going to start with Nancy Reagan, right? Who was kind of a subject, one of our biggest, I guess, bones to pick, as it were, with the Reagan movie.
Yes. Nancy was definitely taken out of the narrative a lot in the Reagan movie. They made it seem like she had no idea that he was going to become a politician at all. They made it seem like she was like, oh, okay, Ronnie, whatever you want, dear. I'll be there for you, and I'll make dinner, and I'll tend to your every need while you're the man of the house. And that's not what it was like at all.
I've heard that from like other podcasts too, like even kind of more, even ones that aren't just a glaze sesh, where it's like, oh, she was just along for the ride, and I was like,
no, she really wasn't.
Not.
I don't know where they're getting their information from. I'll go into a little bit how I did my research, especially with the new book that came out. Well, new, in quotations. I think it came out in like 2016, 2017, like a little bit after she passed away, Nancy. So when I first started doing my research, it was really hard finding a source that was reliable. So there was, when Ronald was looking like he was going to be running for president, you know, a lot of first ladies will do, or potential first ladies will release a book, like an autobiography, most likely written by a ghostwriter. Nancy did that during Reagan's term as a California governor. And she, first of all, it was a very unreliable source because, first of all, it was heavily influenced by her. She, made sure that whatever was put in there was, run by her, edited by her. Like she was very adamant that like it had to be very heavily influenced by her. There was nothing in there that she didn't approve. So that's already an unreliable source. Also, she lied about her age right off the bat. And she lied about like a few things in there where it was either things, maybe not like lied about things, but it was a few things that couldn't be corroborated. So we don't know how reliable of a source that was. The second one is one that came out in the early 90s, and her name was Kitty Kelly. And she was actually known for writing biographies. They were all unauthorized biographies of leaders or people in the spotlight. And this one was also unreliable because it was very critical of Nancy in like a very unflattering light. And there was a lot of things in there that also could not be corroborated. I don't know if you've ever heard, like if you are unaware of Nancy's past, she was in Hollywood, and that's how she met Reagan. But one of the things that a lot of people know about Nancy, even if people aren't really into politics, is that she gave the best blowjob in Hollywood. And that's not something that really can be corroborated. It's also something that most likely was made up by some skeezy producer that didn't like her, or, was trying to make her seem like a floozy or someone that you shouldn't take seriously. And that's something that I was very critical of. And I know people really like to hear stuff like that and they just run with it. But when you're doing research, you have to make sure that it's like, okay, well, can this be corroborated? Probably not. That's not something that it can be said yes or no. But it's also like, who cares? It just seemed very like anti-feminist. It seemed very gross to me. And like, whatever. If she was a good blowjob, who gives a flying fuck? And if she wasn't, then mind your own fucking business.
I think a lot of people had this desire to take her down a peg. And with women,
Yes.
it's like you basically just calling them a slut is
Exactly.
an easy way to take them down a peg.
Right.
So I think that's where a lot of that comes from.
Yeah.
Also, I think people she was they were kind of like the moral couple, the moral police in a lot of sense.
Exactly.
So I think them being like, oh, well, this is the best blowjob in town is a way of like taking a stab at her.
Right.
It
It definitely did.
Totally comes from a sexist place, though.
Yes, it was very sexist, even though it was written by a woman. There's a lot of animosity of women towards other women, and a lot of it has to do with the patriarchy and how it's structured, and that's how the patriarchy keeps itself, fed, pretty much. So, and this is like the early 90s, which is like really, really gross, nasty shit to women, especially. So anyways, I finally came across a newer biography that came out after Nancy's death in 2016 by Karen Tumulty. And this one was really good. She is a Washington Post columnist, so I feel like she has a really good eye for like non-bias and like really delving into a person. As a columnist, you have to be able to delve into someone and see like a full 360-degree view of someone and not just one extreme or the other. So she did a really good job of making Nancy like a full person from both perspectives. And she didn't really try to give away her bias on like how she felt about her one way or the other. And I really like that, because you should be able to, pull from all these things as a researcher or as someone who is doing research, and you should be able to make your own choice on whether this person is someone you like or someone you don't like. Anyways, I'm going to get into her background. So she actually was born Anne Frances Robbins. She was raised by her mother, who was an actress, and her stepfather, who was a doctor. And her stepfather, he did not tolerate anyone he thought was intellectually inferior, which included blacks, Catholics, and Jews. So basically, a Klan member. Nancy loved her stepfather and believed that what he said, that men are to be the leaders and women to follow. And that's something that we're going to see throughout Nancy's life.
He sounds fun to be around.
Yeah, he sounds like a really great husband to her mom, too.
Great at parties, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Actually, there was a interview that I watched with the author of that book, and she was talking about how her mom is really who influenced Nancy to be how she was with Reagan, where she was the keeper of his legacy throughout his entire political career. She made it so that people saw him in a very good light. She didn't even care about that was something that they talked about, where she was like, she had no sense of her own self, but you better be good to Ronnie. She didn't care if you saw her as a floozy or overbearing or, gaudy or anything like negative. She just cared that you saw her husband as the star that he was.
So her success is all through the lens of Reagan's image.
Yes, and that, it makes sense for like how she grew up with her stepdad and her mother. She saw that relationship. They talked about how her mom was someone who had connections to anyone and everyone. And so she would have these elaborate parties where her idea was, okay, my husband's very unlikable. He was a doctor. He didn't really like talking to people. He also, like I said in here, that he didn't like to talk with anyone he saw as intellectually inferior, which is pretty narcissistic. So he was not very well liked. And Nancy's mom would throw these elaborate parties with these political leaders and Hollywood people, because she was in Hollywood. And she would, talk up her husband like, oh, did you hear my husband did this and that? Oh, that's so great. Isn't that wonderful? Wow. And, she actually built up his status amongst these really big, influential people and leaders. And so Nancy grew up seeing that, and that's exactly what she did. And that's what the biggest flaw of this movie, well, no, not the biggest flaw, but one of the biggest flaws of this movie was they basically just made Nancy just kind of be along for the ride, like you were saying. And that's not the case at all. Nancy was so involved in his political career. Back to her. She went to college for acting and acted in things, but never really made it big. She was put on a commie blacklist in 1949. And this is how she met Ronald, because he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. So Nancy had grown up conservative and had always been conservative. And Ronald was more liberal until he met her. And like we said last time, he was a New Deal Democrat. So he really grew up idolizing FDR and all of those influential Democrats. And then Nancy came in and was like, I'm going to change your mind. Here's another chip in her armor. When her and Ronald get married, she's 2.5 months pregnant. One of the things that people really like to talk about with Ronald and Nancy is, oh, they have the moral high ground, and like you should look to them for how you should be married and what a marriage should look like, and they're always good, and it was not coming from the truth. They were having premarital sex.
Gasp.
Right? And Nancy, actually, her dad growing up, he was atheist. And her mom really didn't believe in organized religion. So Nancy really didn't have religion in her life. So when she met Ronald, I think she kind of just she had the mentality of, oh, whatever Ronnie says. So like, Ronald was super, super duper into the Christian faith. And so I'm not sure if she completely was convinced to be in the church with him. I know that she made it seem as though she was. I don't know exactly what her thoughts or beliefs were on that, and it's kind of hard to know. But yeah, contrary to popular belief, she did not grow up religious and was not really raised around that.
That's so surprising to me.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about that. And I've heard Reagan mention God or Christianity or whatever dozens of times. It seems like I don't think I've heard her mention it once.
Yeah.
That is so surprising.
Yeah. It's just, like I said, it's how she molded the view of how image. People saw them. Yeah. And especially him. She, like I said, she didn't care if people saw her in a negative light, as long as Ronnie was the end all be all and had, rainbows coming out of his ass.
That was the end goal.
After they get married in 1952, she convinces him to get into politics because she sees their acting careers fading. She tells him to become the face of conservatism. Him going into politics allowed her to be the wife she wanted to be. She thought that a woman's real happiness and real fulfillment would come from within the home with her husband and children, which I think is really funny coming from her because she famously didn't get along with her children, especially with Ronald's children from his first marriage. Yeah, something I found interesting was that Nancy and Ronald decided to go to Tricia Nixon's wedding instead of Ronald's firstborn son, Michael's. And he famously did not attend her funeral. So they did not have a good relationship. Another thing that tells you exactly how involved in politics and in especially her husband's politics that she was, they went through 6 national security advisors in his presidency and were all fired by Nancy.
That's wild.
Yes.
He's a national security advisor.
Because if you were not with... Even if just a little bit, if there was even like some sort of inkling that you were against her husband, you were out. She was very adamant about his safety and his image. something else that I found really funny was Nancy and Barbara Bush hated each other. Like, capital hated each other.
I love
and
this.
they never would invite the Bushes to the residence.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah.
No, the Bush and Reagan drama is so great.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So one of the things that the author was talking about was basically that, you know, Nancy grew up in a very small household. It was kind of, you know, her mom and her stepdad. She also didn't have like I mentioned before, she didn't have a very good relationship with her children. She was more of a wife than she was a mother. Basically, she famously said, like, her life didn't start until she married her husband, which is a little alarming because she was like in her late 30s when they got married. So it's a little like, okay, like, you weren't a person, but okay, whatever. So on the other hand, Barbara Bush, they had a giant family, at least publicly. Everyone got along. They all loved each other. They were all fun-loving. So they were like kind of like complete opposites of each other. And so they just famously did not get along with each other. And I don't think that was something that was really hidden. I think it was just something that you kind of needed to like have like a good view of, like, if you saw them at a function, you'd be like, oh yeah, they hate each other. But yeah, they famously did not like each other.
You can feel the tension, huh?
Yeah, you could cut it with a knife. So after the assassination attempt on Ronald, Nancy begins to see an astrologer for both of them. And I think that a lot of people used this against her as well, because they were like, what a psycho. Like, why would you get any information from an astrologer and live your life based on a horoscope and look at the stars for your fate or whatever? But to me, like, in a modern day sense, if you're looking at it through like psychology, she just almost lost the person that made her a person, in quotations. And I think it was her way of coping with her husband almost dying.
I remember you were saying that, like, he came closer to dying than what was kind of revealed even in the movie.
Yeah, yeah.
And definitely what was revealed at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. He was a lot closer to death than they made the public believe. She was reeling from that, and she was doing that in the public eye. So, you know, going forward, it you know, especially with the Cold War happening, Reagan was really under a lot of scrutiny as the president. And so I think this was just her way of coping with the fact that she almost lost her husband and lost the light of her life. Soon after his second term ends, he is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it is believed that he most likely had Alzheimer's while he was in office. It was kind of in like later stages than they were thinking when they found out. And there were some signs, like there are videos you can watch. Maybe I can find one and put it in the description, that kind of point out like just what kind of things were going on while he was president with his cognitive abilities.
He was struggling in 1984 because that was a big kind of thing, was like his debate didn't go well and he looked old and slow.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Alzheimer's, it you can have early onset, you know, so it can start a lot sooner than you think. And most likely he most likely had it while he was president for a second term. And I think a lot of like being under like that amount of stress as, you know, leader of the free world.
And his second term was very stressful.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think being under that immense pressure and stress really put a number on his cognitive ability. After he's diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she decides that his lasting legacy will be hers to mold, and she does that for the rest of her life until she dies in 2016. That theme of her job as a woman and as a wife, of basically being the best wife and making sure that your husband looks the best and has the best, was very much seen throughout her entire career and her husband's career. And whether people want to believe it or not, she definitely was involved in his political career. She absolutely had a political career, I would say. She was very heavily involved. She was there for a lot of it. She made lots of decisions that, you know, would shock you. And like I was saying with like the national security advisors, you know, she's a very complex person. She came from a dad who was a He was a narcissist. He was racist. He was old school, is how they would call it. She saw how her mom and him dealt with their marriage, and so she took that to heart. And, you know, when she got married, she wanted to keep him. She would do anything in her will in order to keep him. And like a lot of the criticisms they got to was, you know, that people thought that the way she looked at him and the way that she would just seemed to be like the first time she was seeing him. It was very real. She was very much in love with him. And it's very apparent until basically the day that she died how much she loved him.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because I think, you know, we joked that Reagan ruined everything. So we have this desire to kind of tear this whole thing down. But we have to be honest, and we have to look at it through an intellectually ethical lens. So we can't just be like, oh, yeah, she didn't actually love each other, or make sexist jokes about her giving the best blowjob in Hollywood or stuff like that. Because that's not being honest, and that's not actually wanting to solve the problems.
Right.
That's wanting to kind of complain, and that's wanting to like be almost like the snarky teenager kind of. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to bring some intellectual honesty and to break down the myths of these people.
Exactly.
And because Reagan's myth looms large over America 40
really
years
does.
after he got elected.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about mine now, which is very hyper-focused one. And it's going to have to do with the myth of Reagan as like a cowboy. And I just want to preface this first because we're going to talk about Reagan as he runs for governor. And we're going to talk about kind of this cowboy myth and how it formed. And I think that it really couldn't have come from anywhere other than California and specifically Hollywood, because as much as like Reagan like had a ranch and had the cowboy hat and rode around, he wasn't really a cowboy.
No.
Like Reagan has this image of like a football star and a cowboy, which is crazy because Jimmy Carter was a farmer.
Right.
Gerald Ford was a football star. And then like Lyndon Johnson had the big cowboy hat and grew up kind of in Texas on a ranch. None of them capture the cowboy image like Reagan. And Reagan wasn't even in that many Westerns. He was in 6 Westerns out of his 69 films. I think he had like 40 major ones. So he didn't have this image. All is crafted.
Right.
And it needed to come out of a place like Southern California, which is where his base of support really was. Obviously, he's a Hollywood star. And Southern California, weirdly enough, has a super strong connection to like kind of a cowboy imagery. So when Reagan was running, it was the 1960s. And like cowboy movies, Westerns, were at the height of their powers. 1 out of every 3 productions were Westerns from the 1930s all the way up into the 1970s. And this was also growing into TV. It was just kind of everywhere in Southern California. Like my dad, growing up in Southern California, the street he was on, all the street names were Western stars like Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp. Obviously, I'm named after a Western, the Western chain. Our airport is John Wayne Airport in Southern California. The Anaheim Angels were started by a guy named Gene Autry, who was the singing cowboy who wrote Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. A little bit of trivia there for you. So California has this weird culture of like wanting to be a Western, but it's not Texas or Kansas.
Right.
It's not actually a cowboy place. It is a idealized version of a Western. Which is what Reagan was. He was not a cowboy, but he's what your idea of a cowboy was.
Which is so Hollywood.
It's so Hollywood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of why it was kind of easy for him to step into this role. So we're going to talk kind of about how Reagan really, his policies fit into this Western mythology. And we're going to kind of look at that Western mythology with a critical lens. So I put on here that in the macro, Reagan's view of the world was basically manifest destiny, but for world domination. Fun. So this idea of expanding American exceptionalism, expanding individualism came like coming forth from Reagan. But what we're going to talk about is that when he was governor of California, he kind of expanded this idea of advancing white European culture, advancing white European industry and technology. And we're going to talk about the people he was expanding it on, pretty much. His adversaries, if you will. And we're going to start with Berkeley and the free speech movement. So this one starts very early. This one starts in 1964 when Reagan is at the convention for Goldwater. It's in San Francisco. And some Berkeley students sneak into the convention and they start wearing Klan hoods to mock the fact that Goldwater and Reagan were against the 1964 Civil Rights Act and basically call them out as being racists. And a lot of these kids in 1964, they participate in the Freedom Summer, where they go down to the South. They ride on these buses, a lot of them. Some of these buses get firebombed. These kids get beat up. A few of them get killed. And they bring this kind of experience back to Berkeley. And they want to set up these tables on Sproul Hall, which is kind of like the big administration building. And they set up these tables, and a lot of them were for meetings to engage in the civil rights movement. A lot of them were kind of early anti-Vietnam meetings. They were all in the goal of free speech. We are going to be politically active students, which is kind of, it was not necessarily a new thing, but it was definitely expanding during this time. So the administration ends up saying you can't have these tables, so they have a sit-in at Sproul Hall. The cops get called, you know the drill. And while the cops are taking one of these kids away, they all gather around the cop car, and then they start getting on top of the cop car, and they give speeches, and it becomes a whole thing. Kids get arrested. There's another protest where they have a sit-in at Sproul Hall to protest that arrest, and then those kids get arrested, and so there's another protest so that those kids get freed, and it's just continuing on until 1965 when Vietnam expands. So this is growing and growing and growing, and they're a lot more broad in their goals than like our 1968 one, where those goals were like very specific. They wanted the university to stop dealing with this institute that was basically the research center for the Vietnam War. These guys were way more broad, and like they wanted free speech and like a revolution, man, and like kind of like what they really wanted was they wanted to be not part of the machine.
Right.
So they were noticing that college wasn't really preparing them for life.
Would you say they were raging against the machine?
In a way, yes. Yes. No, I thought of too many good ones. All right, put a pin in that. We're going to get back to that because, as you will see, there'll be those that work forces, and they'll be the same that burn crosses.
Damn. Mic drop.
These kids notice that they are basically just being trained to be part of a capitalist system. They're just basically being trained to do a job to make other people money. And they're, right?
Weird.
Bunch of bullshit, that is. There's a great Mario Savio quote. Mario Savio ends up becoming like the leader of this free speech movement at Berkeley. And he gives this great speech about like how the students feel like the raw materials and the university is kind of producing them into this finished product, and how they're all part of the machine, and how you got to throw your body onto the gears of the machine, and it's really passionate, and it's all basically about like not feeling not experience, what's really alienation, not having your work take out so much of your life that you kind of lose a little bit of your soul.
Yeah.
A lot of these kids were working class kids. The UC system had been grown over the past few decades into the greatest university system in the world at the time. It was considered by many the greatest university system in the world, and it was free for California residents. So
wow, that's crazy.
Yeah,
because you don't see that anymore.
No. And what happened is that it used to be a barrier. So like rich kids went to college because their parents couldn't afford this person not working and going to college. But as wages went up, people started to have a little bit more stable lifestyle and have a good working job. Even if you were in the working class, they could send their kids to college for free. And so a lot of these kids that came from not the wealthy societies started going to class, and they started having access to more like left-leaning Marxist material, even though it was meant to critique it. But they had kind of the opposite effect. They took this material and they ran with it. And this scared the shit out of their parents.
Oh, I'm sure.
And
especially with the propaganda against communism and
exactly
any kind of leftist thinking.
Exactly. So you got to think this is like around the time when the Soviet Union was like our mortal enemies.
Oh, yeah.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis was only like a few years before this. And there was so much tension in the air. So all the normies freak out. And it ends up becoming a national story. You know, it enters the zeitgeist pretty quickly. Like the Beach Boys have a song about it. In The Graduate, he's going to school in Berkeley.
Yep.
And it's kind of that movie captures that kind of disillusionment that a lot of them are feeling. So Reagan runs on this. When he's running when he's thinking about running in 65, he notices the best reaction he gets from the crowd is when he says he's going to clean up the mess at Berkeley. And there's this great clip that we're going to probably include in this where Reagan's addressing this, audience, and he's talking about a dance that they had at Berkeley.
Oh my
and
goodness.
It's like,
oh yeah.
And it's hilarious. Reagan does this a few times where he's like, and the things there were so horrible I can't even mention them here.
They were grinding their hips. They weren't leaving any room for Jesus.
I think he says they were like gyrating in
he's literally like, they literally based Footloose off of this man.
Oh my gosh.
I swear to God.
If you just took this scene out of like context and didn't have Reagan saying it, you would think it belonged in Footloose.
Yeah.
It was hilarious.
That's really funny.
And like, he's like, and they were putting images up on the screen that was meant to look like lava lamps, and like it's
like too groovy, and like if you were doing drugs kind of thing.
Yeah,
it would only look good if you're doing drugs.
Now to us now looking back at it, we're like, who cares? This is like every party. This actually sounds like kind of a lame party by today's standards.
Yeah.
But to the normies and the squares back in 1960, this was like the end of the world. Our kids were like going to school and becoming crazy gyrating Marxists.
Oh my God. You know what? I want to start a band and I want to call it Gyrating Marxists. I call that name.
Oh, you have it.
I have it.
That name.
Oh my God. I love that.
You're going to open for Rage Against the Machine.
Oh, sure.
So he kind of the opposite in terms of like what the kids were doing. He has a debate against Governor Pat Brown, who he's running against, where he says that he's going to institute modern business practices in government. And he says things about like reducing duplications and like making things more efficient. You know, all the garbage corporate stuff today that we have to deal with and that we hate because it makes our lives so much worse.
Right.
And this kind of like industrialization and the crushing of the human soul for technology and industry is captured a lot in Westerns.
Right.
This idea that, like the railroad and steel kind of like cuts a scar across this beautiful open terrain.
Yeah.
And that's kind of captured a lot, especially in like revisionist Westerns, where like at the time they were like, yeah, of course we're going to have industry and towns and railroads and stuff like that. What do you want? Just this open anarchy? And of course the people who like actually liked living with the land and like didn't want that technology to kind of like rip out a piece of their soul were seen as savage or barbaric or immoral. And that same kind of mentality is what Reagan grasps and puts on these kids. So he calls them like brats and spoiled and undeserving of this great gift of education that they're giving because they're not just going along with the system.
Jeez.
And that's also kind of something that you see in Westerns of this time, where maturity and immaturity are kind of paired against each other. So, I have the young upstart gunslinger and then the old vet. And like it's seen kind of as a personality flaw to be young and passionate,
inexperienced, and,
all this stuff. So you compare like a Mario Savio with a Reagan, and one looks like passionate and angry and crazy and emotional, and one looks like the cool, calm, like sheriff coming into town. There's actually political cartoons of Reagan dressed up like a sheriff coming into town, and it says like, let me get one of them free speech varmints.
Oh God.
And he leans into it too. Reagan one of his biggest endorsements is John Wayne, who has a commercial for Reagan dressed up in his full cowboy gear talking about how, why is everyone laughing at Reagan running for president? And he has like a 40-minute promo, or 40-second pitch for him. And he wins off of this kind of like, I'm going to clean up the mess at Berkeley. The government basically is spending too much money caring about poor people. All this stuff captures this kind of conservative movement at the time. And once he becomes governor, he gets some special help from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who he's been like hating Berkeley since 1942, since Oppenheimer was there and running the lab at Berkeley. And he thinks it's all communists. There's communists everywhere. And so he basically teams up with Reagan to be like, hey, we're going to work together on this one. And he thinks Mario Savio and the free speech movement is all just a communist front. And so he can't really do anything once he becomes governor directly. A lot of these institutions and universities kind of have their own contracts and they're run kind of to be independent. So all Reagan can do is go after the budget and just talk shit. And he just talks so much shit. He goes after them for being basically immoral. He goes after them for being bringing the moral vibe of the country down. He ends up firing Clark Kerr, who was himself kind of a protester. He protested loyalty oaths back in the 50s. And he was the one who kind of encouraged more free speech. So he's out. And he gets replaced with a guy named Charles Hitch. And Charles Hitch works for the Rand Corporation. And the Rand Corporation is basically like the R&D department of the military-industrial complex.
Gotcha.
They do some other stuff that isn't as bad. They're a think tank. And so he tries to get a lot of other things done. So he tries to set up a board for the governor to basically approve all the faculty, and he gets Angela Davis, who's a member of the Black Power movement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, fired from her faculty job at UCLA. He tries to sell books in the Bancroft Library, which if you're a real historian out there, I'm just going to give you a minute because that probably made your heart hurt. Bancroft Library is like one of the most prestigious libraries, especially for like Western history in the entire world. It's amazing.
I know nothing about this library.
Going to San Diego State, I heard the Bancroft Library mentioned a million times.
Really?
It is the Western California library for any research. So this all comes to a head, right? Because obviously these kids didn't stop protesting, and Reagan didn't stop calling them out for protesting. So they have this long back and forth over and over again, and it comes to a point when these Berkeley students make the People's Park. So there's this trash heap pretty much that has like old cars that faculty park in sometimes, and the students at Berkeley and the residents of Berkeley clean it up. They move all the stuff around. There's a nice little fountain there. It's basic hippie park. They they play some hacky sack sometimes. It's just a nice place that they fix up together. But since they didn't do it with the university's permission, the university is having none of it. So they put up a big fence. They say they're going to make a soccer field out of it. A lot of the students rally at Sproul Hall, and then they go down to Berkeley to tear down the fence. And they have a big march there. They're marching back to the campus, and that's when the cops are waiting for them. Mm-hmm. Now, the cops are originally supposed to have birdshot in their guns, which I guess wouldn't hurt as bad. It's supposed to be smaller so you don't just destroy a bird. But they grabbed their guns that were already loaded, and their shotguns had buckshot in them. Okay. Which is like the actual hard BBs that are meant to like kill people. So they start, tensions rise. Something gets thrown at the cops. The cops start shooting into the crowd. They injure about 100 people. I think they shoot like 70 people with this buckshot. And then there's one guy whose name is James Rector, who's just like up on a building. He wasn't even from Berkeley. He was visiting friends. He gets shot and he dies a few days later.
Jeez.
Another guy gets hit in the eyes with birdshot and is blinded. So when they hold a vigil for the people that got shot, the National Guard flies by in a helicopter and gasses them.
Wow.
And then some of this tear gas goes into a local hospital.
Oh, my God.
So it's a shit show.
Yeah.
And Reagan is taking no responsibility.
Of course
for
he's
this.
not.
He's saying basically that it's all the university administration's fault for even allowing them to do this in the first place.
Wow.
So that was 1969. This helps Reagan. It makes him even more popular, especially with conservative Democrats. So he wins by a landslide in 1970.
Conservatives are so weird.
Yeah, he killed somebody.
It's just crazy to me that they're like, hell yeah. Yeah, he's not taking responsibility for anything. Fuck yeah, I like that.
And it was all framed as like a moral against amoral.
See, yeah.
Since they were dancing and gyrating with their hips, they deserve to get shot.
Yep.
And there's one line.
How dare they want better for their lives, too? And not want to be a fucking cog in a machine for some rich guy to make more money off of.
And not get, like, drafted or have their friends drafted to go to a fucking war.
Exactly. That literally is something that is killing their friends. It's killing their brothers. It's also... At this point, we're just like, why is this war going on? There's no reason for it.
And Reagan's a big fan of the war. He said,
of course he is.
He said in an interview that his only argument with Johnson's running of the war is that they should do more war. They should be bombing Hanoi, mining Haiphong Harbor, doing all the shit that would just get more people killed. So when these students are protesting, he's like, he just can't understand. Why don't they want war? Why don't they want America to win? They must be amoral communists. That's what it is. There's one line in here where Reagan was talking about to a crowd. He's like, we have some hippies down at the Haight-Ashbury. And he said, one guy, where'd he go? He goes, one guy had hair like Tarzan, walked like Jane, and smelled like Cheetah.
What?
Cheetah's the chimp from Tarzan. So, and he said, he's basically, calling them a bunch of long-haired, smelly hippies who walk like girls.
Yeah.
So, like, all this kind of moralistic, square stuff, he just captures. It's really weird to think that when, like, the Summer of Love, Haight-Ashbury, the gay rights movement, all this stuff was going on in California in the 60s, the governor was the most buttoned up square in the history of squares.
Yeah.
So he's a perfect foil for these hippies. And when people who aren't that way or who are more conservative are looking for basically a hero, they find one in Ronald Reagan. And that's why he wins in 70. These protests go on. After the Kent State shootings, he shuts down all 28 UC campuses, and he encourages private schools to close down as well. And it's all kind of meant to push American industry. It's all meant to, like, stop this new left ideology that is, like, questioning capitalism. So that's why he puts it as a moral issue. That's why he works with the FBI. The FBI did a lot of sneaky, underhanded things to really compromise the new left. They do a lot of sneaky stuff. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Reagan gets out of there in 74. He doesn't want to run again. Oh, keep in mind. So he cuts the UC budget. And he doesn't cut it as much as he wants because the legislature's like, we're not going to cut education. What are you, a psycho? But what he does do is that he gets enough cut that they need to make up this deficit. And they do it by charging the students fees. Mm-hmm. And then this is the first step to tuition. So they start charging these fees. The fees kind of make up for the gap, but more people want the budget tightened. But keep in mind, he builds himself a giant mansion when he first gets to become governor that he never even fucking gets to go into.
Jesus.
Because I think the next governor called it a Shangri-La and like a gaudy monstrosity. Anyway, anyway, it's all garbage. Him saying he wants to be fiscally responsible,
right,
or balance the budget or whatever. It's all meant to just take a chunk out of the people he doesn't like. And then this is where tuition starts.
I.e. poor people and people of color.
Exactly. So this is
also women.
Yes.
Whammon, as I like to call them.
But this is where tuition starts. And since a lot of students can't afford this tuition, this is where loans start. And then this has snowballed into the process we're in now, where people are in
Hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt per person. Billions of dollars of debt in terms of the entire country. All for something that used to be free. So there's some like intersectionality to this. The whole like amoral, dirty communist angle also is a lot to do with like, oh, and they're hanging out with black people now. So he writes this letter to a guy named Glenn Dumke, who was the chancellor of San Francisco State College. And in the letter, he goes, "We wouldn't let a Leroy Jones in our living room, and we wouldn't tolerate this kind of language in front of our families." So now we're going to talk about the Black Panthers. And in our 1948 episode, we talked a little bit about the lies we were told in school about the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And one of them that I was told, basically how the civil rights movement was framed, was that the Martin Luther King civil disobedience, nonviolent part happened first, and then the super radical Black Power movement happens after. But they were happening simultaneously. They're happening at the same time. That includes guys like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. So Malcolm X is killed in February of 1965. We also have the Watts riots going on in 1965. And 65 is a big year for civil rights because the 64 Civil Rights Act is passed, and that's when we start getting a lot of white backlash.
Right.
And white backlash was a term that was used even back in the 60s. So I saw a news broadcast that was kind of breaking down all the elections, and one of the broadcasters asked the other guy, like, "Hey, where's white backlash going to have an impact on these elections?" And one of them he said was California. He said it'll definitely have an impact in California with Reagan's race. And 65 is a very tumultuous year in a lot of ways, especially in California. We have all those protests we were talking about. A lot of them were spurred on by Malcolm X's killing. There's the Watts riots that happens later in that summer. And a lot of discussion has happened, kind of like, where do we go now with civil rights? And in Cambridge, there was a debate that's kind of become famous between James Baldwin, the renowned Black author, and William F. Buckley, who was basically the intellectual face of conservatism. It's funny how big this guy was and like how he's irrelevant now, William F. Buckley. Basically, the only reference I can make for most people out there is that Robin Williams imitated him in Aladdin when he was the genie. And I'm sure all 6 people in the audience laughed at that joke. They're having a discussion on civil rights. And Baldwin has this great quote where he says, you know, when you're watching Gary Cooper kill the Indians and you're rooting for Gary Cooper, you grow up and you realize that the Indians are you. And that's kind of his reference to the state of Black people in America.
Right.
That you don't really grow up thinking that you're a second-class citizen. It's something that is kind of put upon you. That you have to kind of realize that
you're kind of conditioned to think. You're kind of conditioned at a young age. In that societal norm, so it doesn't even come as a question until you are faced with it.
Exactly.
Directly. Yeah.
So like, this second class citizen status is put upon you.
Yeah.
It's another myth that like we kind of need to understand, and that's that the West wasn't for everybody in its initial intention. The West was for the expansion of white European families.
Right.
The land that was going to be settled was meant to be settled by white people.
Right.
And them conquering the West was a point of triumph. And the movies from the 60s, the TV shows from the 60s that were all Westerns were meant for this triumphalism. So when he's talking about Gary Cooper killing the Indians, that is the pop culture grabbing this kind of ideology from the past of white people's triumph over the wilderness that was the West, and it's packaged into a myth that's supposed to be digested for a larger audience, especially for kids.
Yeah.
And the representation of that is always white people being the heroes, and Black people's contributions to the West were completely ignored. And this is how the Black Panthers got started. So Bobby Seale and Huey Newton met at Merritt College in Oakland in 1961. In 65, they form the Black History Fact Group. And what they wanted was for Black people's contributions in the settling of the West to get more recognition. They wanted a African American studies course. They wanted more African American faculty. They wanted Black history to be taught and celebrated. So that is how they got their start. And I think for most white kids growing up in America, you have a very caricaturized view of the Black Panthers as basically, you basically think they're crazy. You're brought up like me thinking that these people are out of their minds, militants that want to kill all the white people. And it's just not true. These were students and in a lot of cases intellectuals who wanted Black people's contributions to American history to be taught and to be known by other people. They formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1966 following the murder of a teenager by San Francisco PD Matthew Johnson. And they started to adopt a lot of Marxist revolutionary ideology, seeing Black America basically as existing inside an internal colony.
Yeah.
So that they were basically the people that were meant to be exploited for their labor and their natural resources by the colonizer group. They embraced kind of Black iconography. They embraced revolutionary ideals. And this was all, again, freaking out the normies.
Right.
Even though they had a right for this kind of discourse. Their biggest initial adversary was the Oakland PD. And the Oakland PD in the 1960s are historically evil. They are just every kind of evil you can think of a police officer. That's the Oakland PD in the 1960s. Now, the way they combat this is by kind of finding a loophole in the law in California. So most people nowadays think of California as having like the most strict gun laws that you ever heard. Oh, you can't even do anything with a gun in California. My dad's told me this a million times. But in the 1960s, it was legal to walk around with a loaded gun as long as it wasn't concealed. And so the Black Panthers start walking around with loaded guns, and they are policing the police. So whenever the police pull somebody over, whenever the police stop somebody, Black Panthers are there to make sure that they don't get harassed or beat up or killed. And this freaks the normies out.
I'm sure.
So, yeah, because from their perspective, you basically have people in black berets wearing revolutionary clothing, wearing Pan-African clothing, or following around, the white police officers, the models of civility and morality and all that stuff. So this becomes something very easy for Reagan to run against. And the white backlash had started occurring even kind of before this. A lot of Black people moved to California after World War II because they had moved out here for the jobs, building all the ships, the bombs, the planes, the whole nine yards. Some of them that were in the military had been out here and been out to California and seen how nice it was. So post-World War II, people from the Deep South move out to California in droves to get away from the Jim Crow South, to get out to beautiful California, to buy up some of the miles and miles of open real estate that was around back then. And I know how the times have changed.
Think about that.
And so to combat what was common for people buying real estate in the 1960s with redlining, with white covenants, with all these things that are meant to keep Black people out, the California legislature signs the Rumford Act, which was brought up by a representative from Oakland and Berkeley, and it was an anti-discrimination bill. Well, that should be fine, right? Except for no, because in 1964, the people of California issued Prop 14, which is meant to repeal the Rumford Act because they wanted to discriminate, I guess. But it's never like they were out there saying like we want to discriminate. What they do is they say that like we want choice. We want the choice to discriminate. Which is just such a little kid mentality, right? It's just such a immature little spoiled mentality of like, but I want to be racist.
Right.
Don't take that away from me.
Yeah. Why would you take that away from me?
So eventually the Prop 14 gets struck down, but this feeling, this momentum is captured by Ronald Reagan, and he gets an assist by the John Birch Society, which is a society run by a bunch of nutcases. So the John Birch Society nowadays does stuff like they do anti-vax stuff and pro-January 6th stuff and whatever, but they started out as a anti-communist society, a very Christian society, even though they never actually said they were a Christian society. They were. And they made a lot of propaganda against civil rights. And basically what they argued was that black people don't actually want civil rights. It's just a bunch of people with an axe to grind that are causing up all this trouble. And Reagan is...
Yeah, they're going against the status quo.
Yes. Right. So it's a veiled way of saying communists.
Exactly.
And this is what Reagan echoes when he's running for president. And it used to be like, if you were a Republican, you didn't want anything to do with the John Birch Society. Everyone thought they were a bunch of nutcases even back then. But Reagan embraces it and leans into it and does not repudiate the John Birch Society. It's basically like our Heritage Fund now, or Heritage Foundation.
Yeah.
Reagan runs on this white hysteria. He comes in saying he's going to be the law and order candidate. Weirdly enough, Law and Order was the name of one of his westerns.
Really?
So, yeah, he captures like he's going to be the sheriff coming into town and cleaning up the ruffians.
I almost feel like his political career at points where he literally just pulled from some of the media he was in. He was like, how would this character deal with this?
No, yes, very much. Like, he definitely thought of it as... I have motivations, right? I have something I'm trying to get across. These are all things that like made him such a good messenger and such a good communicator. Because, we talked about the Goldwater election in 1964. Goldwater got absolutely destroyed. But Reagan is able to take the Goldwater ideas and put them in kind of a message that more people are wanting to digest. And then they're hungry for it because once civil rights actually starts to happen and white people get a little bit antsy that they're actually going to have to, interact with people of another race, he's able to come at the exact perfect time to launch his political career. And so he says things like, when he announces his career, he says that at night our streets become jungles. He uses the term jungle a lot. So the jungle, basically that he's at the edge of civilization. Like, there are clear lines. Like, civilization is here. Everybody who's not civilized, everyone who is basically a barbarian is over there. Clear lines being drawn. He also talks about throwing the bums off welfare. He basically wants to support the police. And then this is where a lot of civil rights cases and Supreme Court cases were happening, like Miranda v. Arizona, which is where the Miranda rights come into play, Mapp versus Ohio, which is basically saying the cops just can't come into your house. They actually need a warrant.
Yeah.
These all come from the 1960s, and Reagan doesn't like any of that. He's saying you need to support the police. He says that claims of police brutality, he doesn't believe them. He says in this interview that Los Angeles has the finest police department in the entire world, and that they've been working on that stuff for a while. And this is where he says the line where people just have an axe to grind, and that civil rights, police brutality, and all that stuff isn't actually what's happening. So he belittles legit concerns about people having their civil rights destroyed and people having basic civil liberties crushed under the boot heel of fucking the cops. So
that's the conservative way.
Yeah, he has a few other problems too. 1966, he goes to the National Republican Assembly. One of his rivals for the nomination calls him out for voting against the Civil Rights Act, and he has a little Ronald Reagan temper tantrum and storms off and has to be brought back to apologize. So it's not looking good. But white people love this shit. So they are the ones who get him into office, and his debates with the Black Panthers, his arguments with the Black Panthers continue, and they come to a head in 1967 when the California legislature is trying to pass the Mulford Act, which is going to take away that loophole that you have a right to carry around a loaded gun with as long as it wasn't concealed.
Gotcha.
And so the Black Panthers show up to Sacramento all with loaded guns, and they walk into the Capitol. and they're walking into the Capitol, and they get all the way basically to the chambers when they start. The cops finally like push them back, and this is all captured too. We'll leave a link for the video, the primary source. All of this is captured. Bobby Seale gives a speech on the Sacramento steps saying we do not hate anyone based on their color, because again they had to fight off this thing that you just hate whitey, but no. Bobby Seale says, we do not hate anyone based on their color. We hate oppression. And that's what they were fighting against. So this imagery is all captured. The Panthers read off the ordinance where they say they can carry guns. They reference the Second Amendment. They reference all these things. None of it matters, because as soon as they leave the Capitol and stop at a service station, they get arrested. And they get their guns taken away from them. And, of course, since this is a violation of their Second Amendment rights, the NRA comes down for the Black Panthers. And no, I'm just fucking with you.
Yeah,
no, they totally are for the Mumford Bill, because they supported,
anything to do with black suppression.
Right. Yeah. So the NRA back then was for gun laws, and they were going to be definitely for this one, since they were for suppressing the rights of black people. And then this can be seen in today with the case of Philando Castile, who is that guy who had a legally registered gun in his center console, and then the cop shot him when he told him he had the gun in front of his 4-year-old.
Yeah.
And the NRA didn't say jack shit about it.
Of course not.
Because we're going to talk about this more, but a lot of these ideals that conservatives hold are empty. They're not real. They are simply for the expansion of white supremacy. And another example of that is that after this happens in Sacramento, the Panthers turn more towards creating these great social programs. Mm-hmm. So they have all these health clinics that open up. One of them is still in operation in Seattle. They also have a free breakfast program, one of the first in the entire country. So free lunch programs, school lunch programs started after World War II as a way to have all this excess food so farm prices didn't go down. But the Panthers were the first one to utilize scientific research to figure out that kids going to school hungry makes it harder for them to learn. So they fed thousands of kids all throughout California with this free breakfast program.
That's amazing.
They had a lot of other social programs that were pooled resources. So basically what they were doing was creating a small government. And we think of Reagan as being the guy with the small government. But does it sound like it's small government to, create, to rush a bill through to take away people's guns? Is it small government from a conservative mind point to crush protests and get somebody killed by the cops and tear gas protesters with a helicopter? That's not small government. That's all oppression. Small government is a free breakfast program. Small government is making sure your people are safe from an outside oppressor. This is small government. But because it's framed in a way of being not white and not American, similar to the way Native American people were seen as not having a culture or a society because it wasn't white culture and It wasn't white society.
Exactly.
It's not a one-on-one comparison with black people to Native Americans, but this kind of mindset that our civilization, white European Anglo-Saxon civilization, is the dominant civilization, and we're going to prove it to you even if it kills you, was the same kind of mindset that guys like Reagan used to put their boot on people like the Black Panthers. And they got help, again, by J. Edgar Hoover. Because J. Edgar Hoover's and the FBI's COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, basically drove the Black Panthers into the ground by having informants in there. They wrote letters because they had handwriting experts that were supposed to be from one Panther to another or one Panther to another, and it gets intercepted on purpose to make it seem like they were all out to get each other. And this is a huge amount of government resources being used to crush people who at this point were just against police brutality and pro-free breakfast programs.
Right.
But Hoover said that they were one of the most dangerous institutions internally to American society. So the the Panthers get crushed under the weight of the federal government. And this is kind of what we mean when we say institutionalized racism. Because we have the FBI, the federal government. We have Reagan, the state government. We have the Oakland Police, the local government. We have the John Birch Society, which is a private institution. Every level is all geared to maintain the status quo and to maintain white supremacy. That's what we mean. And it's not like this idea went away, because certain responses to Black Power and the Black Panthers in particular were utilized all the way up until now. One of them started in LA, and it was the Special Weapons and Tactics, SWAT. SWAT, one of their first operations, was a raid on the Black Panther headquarters in LA. And from that point on, SWAT and the militarization of police grew. And it reached kind of its prime, I guess you could say, with the war on drugs, which was a program started under Nixon that was expanded and weaponized against Black America by Reagan. And so now we're going to talk about what the face of the war on drugs kind of was, with something that we're all kind of familiar with, I think, especially kids who grew up in the 90s, which is the Just Say No program.
Yeah. What a failure that was. So the Just Say No campaign was run by our girl Nancy. That was her mission while she was First Lady. And basically the initiative was to tell people to say no to experimenting or using drugs of any kind. And this started in the early 80s, and it continued for more than a decade. She traveled around the country promoting the campaign, going on talk shows and visiting some drug rehabilitation centers to speak about the campaign with people, which I think is really funny that she's going to like these drug rehabs where people are currently in the dregs of this horrible disease. And she's like, have you ever thought about saying no? And they're like, yeah, I wish I could.
I got one word for you. Gonna change your life.
Yeah.
No. You're welcome.
Wow. I'm doing the Lord's work. So before the rollout of this campaign, there was a spike in public concern of drug use as the number one problem, from 6% in 1985 to 64% in 1989. So in 1983, DARE, so D-A-R-E, drug abuse resistance education, was implemented in about 75% of school districts in the United States, which this pairs students with local police officers in an effort to reduce drug use, gang membership, and violence. We are children of DARE. I remember the last DARE program that I was a part of was in 4th grade, and I remember that the local officer came in with a literal suitcase of all these drugs and was like, hey, see all these freaking crazy drugs? Look at them. Yeah, look at them. Pass them around. He like passed it around, and we were able to.
No way.
Yeah, we were able to like go up and look at it, and then he was like, don't do it. Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't that cool?
Little 9-year-old kids that are just like, what the hell is going on?
He's like telling us, like, now this is cocaine. Now this is for if you want to stay up all night.
Yeah, no, he literally would say shit. Yeah, like the speed gives you all this energy, and it makes you act erratic and makes you want to go fast. It makes you turn into Ricky Bobby.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it was a crazy program. So despite the program's popularity, several studies have shown that it does not do much to help keep away people from future drug use. So in 2001, Dr. David Satcher, the Surgeon General, he put this initiative in the Ineffective Primary Prevention Program. So he said that it's ineffective. It doesn't work.
That'd be W's Surgeon General too.
Oh, yeah, 2001. Yeah. So Reagan's war on drugs program was criticized for being too focused on deterrence rather than rehabilitation programs. And we still see that today in the United States. It was also criticized for causing mass incarceration for nonviolent crimes, with a vast majority being people of color. To this day, there are still around 360,000 people that are still in the prison system today for nonviolent drug offenses, which would not be considered illegal today. Studies have found that the program led to only short-term reductions in tobacco use, but had no impact on any other substances. It literally just introduced kids to this like crazy world of drugs. Yeah. And they were just like, wait, so you said that I would have all this energy? Oh, fuck yeah. I'm going to try that one day.
Well, at like 9, I didn't know what speed was. So we didn't have the cops come around and show us the drugs. We just had the cops kind of come around and scare us a little bit. But all we cared about as kids was that if you got the wristband, then you got a free Slurpee.
Yep.
So that's all we cared about.
I don't remember that. Like I said, I was in 4th grade the last time I remember doing a DARE program because they took it out of my school.
Yeah.
That was the last year.
You were there probably at the tail end.
I was the very tail end of the DARE program. The 1980s war on crime policies and the laws, they still impact a lot of Americans today. We still see the effects of it. And it's primarily the effects are seen especially on marginalized groups of people and on the poorer groups of people. So this mass incarceration that happened because of the war on drugs, it was like the main focus was on black people mostly. Black people and people of color. They were the ones who were thrown into these prison cells and given lifelong sentences for things that are now legal, like marijuana.
Also, like the methods they kind of use to do this, like SWAT was only used for like the most serious emergencies, like hostage situations or bank robberies or things like that. But during the war on crime in the 80s, it went from like single digits, their use in drug raids, to 80% of what they did was drug raids. Most of the time, if you're seeing SWAT being used now, it is for a raid to capture drugs. And then this is how you get stuff like people getting killed from no-knock warrants and things like that. So the ever-increasing militarization against drugs on a particular group of people kind of reinforces the Black Panthers' stance that a lot of black people feel, that they are living in an internal colony, that they are there for only their labor and their resources to be extracted, but nothing to be given back. And that is the Reagan legacy in a lot of ways. It is a rejection of what came from guys we studied before, like Hubert Humphrey, or guys we studied before, like Johnson or MLK, or any of these people that wanted to change the structure of white superiority. Reagan came in and basically be like, guys, it's like these Westerns we watch. White superiority is a good thing. White supremacy is what won us the West. Why would you go away from that? He didn't say it in those exact words, but he grabbed the feeling of that.
I feel like Reagan was very much the early version of the people we see nowadays, where it's like, well, it was people weren't so sensitive back then, and people didn't care about gender and being called the right name and pronouns, and people are just, they're little softies now, and I feel like he really encapsulated that kind of mentality, and I think that's why he is still seen as such a prominent figure, especially in older conservative people, because they're like, oh, see, I wish we could go back to the Reagan days when he just was like, hey, stop being a bum, not realizing that when he said bum, he meant a person of color.
Yeah, and that's how we get like the welfare queen thing.
Yeah.
So it was these dog whistles, and then also it's something that you, like a person who would say stuff like that is also somebody who's going to be like, I just believe in common sense. And that was a big thing that Reagan says in a lot of these campaign appearances when he's running for governor.
I feel like that's kind of back.
Common sense guy. Oh, it's come back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
And what we got to understand is that, common sense for you.
Right.
It is your common sense based on how you were raised and the things that you carry with you. It's not common sense for everyone. That's just not how common sense works.
Absolutely.
And like, I think what else is this glorification of the past and this mentality of sticking your head in the sand for anything bad, this mentality that it was all rosy way back when. And really, that why I think I'm so enamored with this kind of time that we've been covering, this like 1945, 46 to 67, 68 kind of period, is that it really felt like for a lot of people, they were dedicated to the future, to making things better, to making society and the world we live in better.
Even if they didn't live to see it.
Even if they didn't live to see it. It was for the future.
Right.
And it was for people that are going to outlive them to have a better life. And you're not going to get that if you're stuck in the past. If you're still looking at the Old West for your model of morality or society, then you're not going to move forward.
Absolutely. And, yeah. Looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to miss a lot. There's going to be so many things that you're going to forget about the context of things. And we have this thing where we romanticize the past. And the reason we made this today is basically to kind of show you how dangerous that can be. We have a presidential candidate who is running on a lot of what Reagan stood for. He is trying to encapsulate that exact same, remember when back in the day when we could just say whatever we wanted, which was like super racist and really fucked up, and like no one said anything because, we were the leaders of society. God, wouldn't that be so nice if we could have that again? And, but I'm not racist. No, that's just the status quo. That's just what we're used to. And he's getting a scary amount of people that are falling for this rhetoric. So, proceed with caution. When you're looking at the past, make sure you have the context, do your research, make sure it's not skewed one way or the other. As I told you in the beginning with Nancy, I found one that was heavily influenced by Nancy, and I found one where it was heavily influenced by someone who absolutely did not like her. You have to make sure that you're doing the proper research. You're not romanticizing something that happened in the past. We want future generations to be able to live a good life that they are entitled to, absolutely entitled to. You are entitled as a human being, you are entitled to a house, you're entitled to an education, you're entitled to food, and you're entitled to all of the luxuries. Yeah. Why does one person get more than another person?
Yeah, entitled to like clean drinking water,
right? Safety,
not being like attacked by the police.
Exactly.
Like those aren't things that are complaints. Those are things that you need to live.
You're also entitled to voice your concerns when you see disparity and you see unfairness in the system. Absolutely. The whole reason we have a democracy is so that we can raise our voices and be like, hey, we don't like this. Let's vote this out.
That was another one of the weird things. So like, even people that like I feel would have been opposed to Reagan in like the 80s or even earlier have now like kind of fallen in like a Trumpian orbit.
Absolutely.
And it can be seen in Reagan because Reagan protested in college. He was a college protester because they were going to furlough institutions during the Great Depression because of budget cuts. And he protested to keep the university open. But for some reason, it was just a little different when the Berkeley students did it.
I wonder why.
Yeah, it's just... so.
What made them so different?
Yeah, you kind of got to ask those questions because we're going to fall into the same pattern of like, well, it was fine when I did it, but it's not good when like you do it because reasons. And we're just going to keep kind of falling in the same up and down and up and down, up and down until we kind of...
And then guess what? We're not going to get anything done.
Yeah.
None of the things that need to change are ever going to change because we're just going to be stuck in the past.
It does feel like a 2-step forward, 1 step back,
Absolutely.
Or even 1 step forward and 2 step back.
I would say 1 step forward, 2 steps back now.
It does feel that way. But something we got to tell ourselves is that this isn't very old. This is not like student loan debt is one of the most crushing issues of our time. It's only about 2 generations old.
That's crazy to think about.
Like my parents were basically about to go into high school when student debt really started to take off. It's not anything that we can't reverse. It is not too big for us. None of these problems we covered today are too big for us. We just need to educate ourselves. We need to focus, and we need to believe it's possible, because they're banking on your apathy, and they are banking on your doomerism feeling that
You're just one person. How am I going to change anything?
exactly.
Yeah.
That is what they are hoping.
That is
you're gonna
exactly
feel.
what they would like. So we're going to end it there. We're going to talk about Reagan and more of his presidency and the failings of his presidency next time. So stick around, and thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, you're awesome. Send this to your friends. Send this to anyone who you think would be interested in this. I know Reagan is a hot topic right now. And with the mythology that is Reagan, I think it's so important that we see him in a critical lens. And we see him and Nancy more in like a 360 kind of view. Because they are people at the end of the day. They're human beings. They have pasts. They had, things that they had to conquer throughout their lives. We're going to end it there. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple.
Follow us on Instagram.
Yeah. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on TikTok. We will see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Don't be stuck in the past, because
the future is ahead of us.
Thank you all. Love you.
Love you? Question mark?
I'm broke.
Bye.